Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Greenfields Green Dollars. My name is Rachel Cochran. I'm a Water Quality Associate with OSU Extension, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Clint Schrader.
Yep, I'm the Program Manager for Ohio Farm Business Analysis Program.
And also joining us today, we have a special guest, Bruce Clevenger.
Good morning. I'm Bruce Clevenger. I'm a field specialist for farm management for OSU Extension.
And today our topic is drainage. So let's start a little bit with the history of drainage. Do you want to start on that, Bruce?
Sure, drainage is so common in Northwest Ohio. I think we sometimes forget about how important farm drainage is to crop production and even supporting livestock production. And really, about anything we do in Northwest Ohio, drainage is very important. So the history of agricultural drainage it started out as a conservation practice. So many acres that were bringing into crop production. There were soil erosion issues where water was running across the surface. And in fact, installing subsurface tile drainage improves the ability of that water to flow through the soil profile and helps reduce soil erosion off the surface. And that was one of the reasons that it was a cost-shared best management practice back when many of the acres were getting tile for the very first time.
And even before tile drainage, drainage itself is important, especially here in Northwest Ohio. We used to be the Great Black Swamp, so it goes even further back than tile drainage. So some benefits we might see of drainage. Here we're standing in front of a soybean field, which is tiled. We see a lot of times better water infiltration in tile drain fields, obviously, because it can drain. And like you mentioned, erosion control. Any other benefits, Clint?
The big one that I see is increasing our days suitable for field work, allowing us to get on the field a little bit quicker, maybe get into a better planting window, or causing less damage during our harvest operations.
Yep. Also, increased water infiltration leads to those deeper roots, so that if we get into a drought, they can maybe pull from that deeper water table. And we can see an increase in biodiversity from deeper aeration in the soil. So moving on from the agronomic perspective, do you want to show us, Bruce, what drainage tile looks like?
Yeah, pretty simple concept. The drainage that we install today is corrugated plastic tubing. The corrugations are these ridges, which actually gives the tubing its strength. But decades ago, clay tile, was the material buried in the soil, which the gaps between the individual clay pieces, which was how most of the water would enter into that clay tile. But in a corrugated plastic tubing, there are slices or slots that are cut in during manufacturing that allow water that is moving by gravity only towards and around this plastic tubing, and then this becomes then the conduit that delivers excess water or gravitational water out of the soil profile and delivers it safely then to an outlet or a surface ditch in Northwest Ohio.
And do you know, Bruce, how long have we been using plastic drainage tile?
Yeah, since the 60s and 70s it really picked up and transitioned from the clay manufacturing to the corrugated plastic tubing.
Cool. All right, moving on to the economic portion of this. So Clint, you have some national data for us, right?
Yeah, so again, this data comes from the FinBin data set. We've talked about that before. But it does include Ohio data as well as several other states, Minnesota, some of the Dakotas, Missouri, Nebraska. And so today, just looking at a 10-year time frame, so 2015 to 2024, looking at yields on fields that are pattern tiled versus fields that have no tile whatsoever. Over that 10-year time frame, we saw an increase in corn yield, comparing those two groups, of about 20 bushels to the acre, which was about an 11% increase. And then on the soybeans, the difference was 13.78 bushels. And so again, I think we got to remember some of this data is coming out of Minnesota and some of those other areas where maybe that drainage tile is extending the growing season or allowing them to extend the growing season. And so this is what we kind of see on the national level, a huge difference on the soybeans of 31%. And so I think that, greater yield obviously is going to put a lot more money in your pocket. But I think that kind of leads into some of the work that Bruce has done here as far as installing these systems in Ohio and what the payback is on that.
Yeah, and you've done actually some research right here at Northwest, right?
And other locations. So Defiance County has a great drainage research farm as well, where I spent some of my career at. But we are standing here at the Northwest Research Station for Ohio State University, home of one of the longest, maybe the longest, currently and ongoing drainage systems for yield response, water quality, economics, all being looked at on these plots. Since 1984, these plots have had multiple tillage systems, multiple crop rotations, and have sustained a non-drained or an undrained plot, as well as a 50-foot drain spacing, as well as some other conservation practices. But over that, the data was summarized in most recently a 25-year study. The yield advantages were very impressive, comparing the undrained compared to the improved drainage that we saw from drainage. And that corn yield response was roughly 39 bushel advantage to having farms in Northwest Ohio drained. The yield advantage for soybeans was just under 12, so 11.5 bushel, and that is a significant increase when you go from undrained fields to having a system like this installed.
Right. And does that take into account almost instant, once you put the tile in, it behaves completely differently?
It's impressive how soon the drainage system will respond. Contractors have told me, and I've seen it firsthand, where we are installing tile and they're closing that trench and that water is already beginning to flow from that field. So proper installation, good soil conditions, soil health, soil quality, all helps that system work by gravity.
You also mentioned this morning before we started recording that these plots have been given a new life with some new additions to the study. So do you want to talk about that a little?
Sure, there's interest by landowners and producers to narrow the drain spacing where the laterals are placed in the field. So I mentioned these are 50-foot drain spacings originally, and now the new refreshed system here on the farm, we have added 25-foot drain spacings, and we're going to continue to keep the yield of all three of those, the undrained, the 25-foot spacing, and also the 50-foot spacing. And so originally the 50-foot spacing was put in at the economic optimum spacing. And so the trend, though, narrower drain spacings, it does bring up some economic costs. It also brings up some water quality issues that we must manage. But at the same time, landowners and farmers are realizing benefits for really improved drainage across the Midwest.
Yes, and as you mentioned, water quality is a concern with drainage. Obviously, we don't want to drain more water than we need because those crops need it. So we need to balance, letting those nutrients leave the field through the water and having enough there for the crop. So with that, how do we understand the benefits financially of installing drainage?
Well, one of the farmer conversations that might happen would be a payback period. And so this is an economic calculation. We either talk about it as the tailgate calculation or conversation or back of the envelope math. And the payback period is what I've been most recently talking about. A payback period essentially is if I have a capital investment of X number of dollars, it should generate new revenue from that field. Well, how many years does that new revenue take to pay back that capital investment of that new drainage system? So we call that the payback period. And the payback period is going to be represented in years when those costs versus the revenue balance.
All right, Bruce, so when you talk about payback period, what all cost or materials are we looking at in that calculation to figure out total cost versus maybe increased revenue that's going to happen?
Great question, because we need to know the cost of the capital investment, so the cost of the drainage project. So the cost of material, the cost of the design of the system. We have to pay a contractor or ourselves to install it. We also take into account the cost of the money, whether that's borrowed money or if it's our own opportunity cost. We're using cash from the farm or our own savings account to pay for that capital investment. Those are the costs that really go into determining what's the investment total for that. The other part of that is we have to calculate the revenue benefit that we expect. And this might be the tricky part. because it can be difficult to project, well, how many more bushels of corn or soybeans am I going to receive because I've improved that drainage system. But it's nice to go through it on the back of the envelope or on scratch piece of paper and go through that conversation so we have an estimate of, well, how many years is it going to take to generate the revenue to pay back that capital investment.
So in general, you think about a payback period. Let's pretend we have a field that's got no tile at all. What kind of time frame are we kind of looking at with today's numbers as far as return on that investment?
It's roughly a 10-year period. So what I use in that calculation is current cost of installing a drainage system, the expectation that we're going to realize maybe that for the Ohio data, are we going to get that 30% yield increase on corn? Are we going to get that 23% yield increase on soybeans? Those are assumptions.
Yeah.
But we take current costs, we also take current grain prices, and we take that improvement of how many more bushels that we're going to expect to receive. From those calculations, it's not difficult math, but it's a simple math formula, and we can come up with roughly a 10-year payback period, which might require, we think about a long-term lease agreement. We might have a long-term lease agreement of 10 years if we're going to partner on how that cost of that investment is paid for.
Now, Bruce, this is super helpful just to talk about, but if I'm a producer and I'm considering putting this on a field that maybe hasn't had any drainage at all, is there a way that I can sit at home at my own computer and run these numbers myself?
Great question. So I have developed a spreadsheet calculator for this because every scenario is going to be different. You know, my drain spacing is going to be different than Clint's and maybe yours. Your cost of materials might be a little bit different. You may be cash flowing it out of your deep pockets, and Clint and I might be borrowing money at 8% rather than the opportunity cost of 4% of your using your own money. So with that, and then our yield expectations are going to be potentially different. I may be moving from a average farm and trying to achieve a top producing farm, or I might be having a poor producing farm and I'm just trying to get to be a Northwest Ohio average farm. So all these scenarios are different. Therefore, the spreadsheet calculator can be very helpful in putting in our own numbers and the yield expectations and prices, and that can really start showing the difference in how variable the payback periods can be from situation just down the road, maybe from another farm.
You mentioned this is eventually going to land somewhere on a web page, but for the time being, can folks reach out to you to get a copy of that spreadsheet?
We sure can. We can either run that calculator over the phone or a video meeting, or bring it to the farm and do a farm visit. Or I'm glad to share the Excel spreadsheet out with producers. It's in our version right now, version 4, so we've made some improvements and put some instructions in it. And then also the spreadsheet calculator also estimates the total cost of the project. So we end up knowing what the cost per acre is. Well, then it can break it down by each itemized detail in the invoice from the contractor, because maybe we know we're installing drainage on 55 acres. So it helps us to know that total bill minus the cost of financing, whether I finance it myself or go borrow money.
So Bruce, you mentioned maybe this being an improvement, trying to improve the land. So it's not necessarily just for the farmers, but also landowners have to think about that improvement. Talk a little bit about how that might affect a cash rental rate if you make some of these type of improvements.
Great question, Clint, because a landowner may want to invest into drainage, but at the same time they're improving that asset. Therefore, it's probably more productive, and therefore it's more valuable as a property to be rented. So mentioning that, well, if I have an average farm, how do I get it to be a top producing farm in Ohio? So I did some calculations based on OSU Extension's data when we report what are some survey data for cash rents in Ohio. So with that data set also comes yield expectations. So an average producing farm in Northwest Ohio would have roughly a corn yield of 185 bushels the acre on average. That same average farm would be 56 bushels on soybeans. But if I expect drainage to move that field from average to top producing, that top producing farm now has to produce 220 bushels the acre on corn and almost 67 bushels on soybeans. So that's an increase of 35 extra corn bushels per acre and 11.2 extra soybean bushels per acre. If drainage, in fact, can accomplish that as an improvement, then the data would suggest that we may have a differential of about $56 in cash rent. That maybe the landowner now can maybe expect to be paid more in that realm of $50 to $56 more in cash rent because the productivity increased because of drainage. There's some ifs in there, and there's some assumptions, but that's kind of how I've used some of our existing survey data to help answer that question on cash rents.
Okay, Bruce, so you talked about maybe a 10-year payback period on tiling ground that's not had any tiles on, but you said splitting laterals are coming in and adding, going from that 50-foot spacing to maybe a 25. What are the implications there that you might see?
I think those implications are very real, because the expectation to get that 30% increase on corn and that 23% yield increase on soybeans from splitting laterals probably is, we have to be cautious, because improving that field's drainage by splitting the laterals, we already have some improvement, probably some significant improvement in drainage by already having that pre-existing system there. So contractors and myself, we're all very cautious about going back to that OSU data and say, yeah, you're going to get that 30% bump in corn yields. We got to be careful, because so much, and rightly so, Northwest Ohio farmland has already seen some of the benefits of improved drainage. So additional investments come with a caution, and the calculator then allows us to really input some realistic yield increases, whether it's per bushel or throwing in a percentage. That's where the calculator can be helpful in determining that maybe that 10-year payback period is going to look like more like 17, because the yield expectation is realistic when splitting laterals.
Yeah. So I guess stay tuned for all the research happening out here. 10 years from now, we'll have some good answers to those questions about maybe a percentage increase there.
Season 12 of Greenfield's Green Dollars.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, Bruce, do you want to share with us the golden rule of drainage?
And I didn't come up with the golden rule. There are professors and from North Carolina State. I think Dr. Skaggs from North Carolina State is one of the originals that were quoted. The golden rule: drain only the water from a field, essentially to improve trafficability and crop yields, and not a drop more.
Not a drop more. So with that, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.